And so moving along in Gebser then to chapter 3 of volume 2, it's called The Nature of Creativity. And Gebser now begins to move on in his analysis to working out or elucidating the manifestations of the aperspectival in the concrete world of the humanities, specifically in poetry and painting and sculpture and architecture and so forth. And he begins with poetry, which is of course one of the earliest of humanities written and also oral art forms. And particularly he's interested in the evolution of the idea of the Muses and in how the Muses have changed over time. Homer begins with sing in me muse, but then by the time we get down to Rilke says in the first of his duetto elegies, who if I cried out amongst the angels would even hear me. We have a fundamental change, something drastic has happened to the poet's relationship to the Muses by the time we get to Rilke, because when he looks up to the heavens there is a resounding silence that meets him. So as Heidegger says, being has now abandoned beings. Human beings have been abandoned by the gods, and the role of the poet is a different thing now, and so that's what we want to look at in Gebser. I also want to take the analysis into popular culture by glancing with a side glance at William Gibson's short story Johnny Mnemonic, which is the title Mnemonic gives away. Also has and bears out the relation, the modern creative artist's relationship to the Muses. Gebser begins his analysis by looking at the role of the Muses in Homer. Homer invokes them at the beginning of the Iliad and also at the beginning of the Odyssey. And the Muses, as he says, were originally threefold. Robert Graves says the same thing in The White Goddess. There were originally 3 Muses. Later there's 9. That's a later development. But that the chief amongst them was mnemosony. Mnemosony, memory, recollection, is the primary of the Muses, because the Muse has to do with the latent memory of history, and the poet, in invoking the Muse, is invoking the sort of historical cosmic consciousness of the sum total of all the events that have taken place. And he summons them to his memory, as it were, and draws from them in the shaping and articulating of the world that he's beginning to form in poetry. And so Gebser will say that the Muse is actually partly mythical and partly mental. It's a tool used by the mental consciousness structure. It comes in simultaneously with the Greek development of the mental consciousness structure, and it's a tool for organizing and shaping the image floods of the mythical consciousness structure. So it has a very close relationship to the mental consciousness structure. And he also says that the Muses were originally water nymphs, hence the phrase well springs of inspiration. The Muses were associated with springs, with rivers. Creativity is associated with rivers. And also the idea that, as in the first volume where he had talked about the 2 different aspects of the soul, that the soul's life pole was associated with water, whereas the soul's death pole was associated with winged beings, and hence with the air. The Muse was originally associated then with the soul's life pole because of its creativity and its invigoration and its world-shaping potentiality that it confers upon the artist, the poet, to bring cosmos, to shape a cosmos into being out of a chaos. So it's linked with, in origin, the soul's life pole, not the death pole. By the time we get to Rilke, notice when Rilke invokes his version or his equivalent of the evocation of the Muses is who if I cried out would hear me amongst the angels, is really now the angel of death. And the winged being is descended from originally the Egyptian Ba, the human-headed bird, down through the sirens and the harpies to the angels. We have in Rilke, significantly at the end of the mental consciousness structure epoch, into its deficient phase, an invocation of the soul's death pole, the muse of death, as it were. So something fundamental has happened, something really catastrophic has changed there by the time we get down to Rilke, where the imagery has shifted from the soul's life pole to the soul's death pole. And really you get the cosmic silence there. The Muse is no longer singing through the poet. He's terrified almost to even invoke the Muse. And so this begins then his discussion of the Muses. And what he will go on to do then is to analyze the poetry of the 19th century. And he'll start looking at the poems of the 19th century and say that in poets like Hölderlin and Novalis and Baudelaire, the French symbolists, they no longer invoke the muse. And he says there's a reason for this, and it's utterly significant. They don't invoke the muse, and if they do, they invoke it in an ironic way. But more often they'll evoke either science or some form of thinking, some form of contemplation, but no longer the muse, because the poet no longer wants to surrender, by the 19th century, give himself over to the muse. He wants to be the muse's master, as a statement of Paul Valéry that he quotes. He wants to be the master of the muse, no longer to surrender himself in good Platonic fashion to the muse and go into a kind of ecstatic trance state through which creativity just pours itself through him. He wants a more conscious role in controlling the poetry. And what Gebser says then is this is a manifestation then of the beginnings of the disengagement of consciousness from time, the perspectival consciousness structure. Remember, a little Spengler might help to elucidate what Gebser is talking about here. Remember how Spengler had said that with Faustian civilization, you get the concern with infinite space, but also a concern with the most historical consciousness. Faustian civilization is the most historically concerned consciousness in history. So the muse, because the muse has to do with recollection, also has to do with history. In skipping or eliding or getting rid of the muse, the poet is disengaging himself from time, from being bound by a temporal consciousness during the perspectival phase of the mental consciousness structure, disengaging himself from it and shifting into the integral aperspectival consciousness, which, as Gebser has said, is both space-free and also time-free. So it's time-free, so the poet's consciousness now is no longer dominated by the muses, because the muses are time and memory and history, and he himself is no longer dominated by a historical sensibility. So really what Spengler had said about the decline of the West beginning in the 19th century, Gebser more or less agrees with here in saying that for Spengler the authentic thing about the West was this concern for infinite space and also its intensely historically oriented consciousness, which begins to slip with the rise of aperspectivity in painting, and at the same time that we begin to get our poets moving away from the muses and away from being bound by a time consciousness. We do have a threshold there, a singularity takes place, what Gebser calls a mutation, and Spengler just sees it as a decline, a sliding off into something other than what the West was good at, what it was great at, how it saw and organized its cultural forms in the world. And Gebser sees it as a mutation into a new consciousness structure that is space-free. It's no longer dominated by infinite space, but at the same time it's also time-free, because it's no longer dominated by the muses, by the need to be dominated by a historical consciousness. So we're shifting with this period into a space-free, time-free world, and the poet's process is the process of what Gebser calls now systasis. Systasis is the integration of elements to create and form a whole. And so this disengaging from a historical consciousness moves the poet out of being bound into the mythical and mental and magical realm, into the realm of the spirit. The integral consciousness structure is governed by the spirit, whereas the magical consciousness structure had been dominated by the instincts, and in the mythical we have the soul with all of its images, and in the mental we have the intellect. So too, by the time we get to the integral consciousness structure, now we shift from the realm of the soul and all of its image floods and the realm of the intellect and all of its conceptual elaborations and abstractions to the realm now of the spirit, which is crystalline, pure, diaphanous, utterly sober, clear, irrational, not irrational thinking, that is more concerned now no longer with looking at objects in space that are visible to the eye and seeing how they interrelate to each other, but an awareness now, an a-waring, as Gebser puts it, of the processes of thinking, the processes of consciousness itself. There's becoming a self-awareness now that Gebser terms verition, which he means seeing through, imparting truth. The spirit opens up and it illuminates and renders the world diaphanous, transparent to spiritual energies. And these are not emotionalistic, as in the New Age. They're not irrational, as in the magical or the mythical. It's irrational, utterly sober, utterly clear, space-free, time-free, no longer bounded by a world of the visible, but a world that is perceptible by the mind, and not through mere abstractions and concepts, but through a new kind of clarity of thinking that is able to draw from the other consciousness structures and to use them. So in the integral consciousness structure, we have not only the integration of time. Time is integrated, but it's also used. It's time-free because the poet now is more concerned with using time, with using history, and not being used by it, no longer allowing himself, because he's transcending the ego also. It's also ego-free. It doesn't dispense with the ego and dismantle it in favor of a unio mystica, as in Hinduism, but it's not bound and nailed down to the ego in its single mono-perspective, subjectable view of the world. It tries to perceive the world as a whole now, and to see it with a new sober, crystalline purity that is proper to the realm of the spirit and no longer mired in the image floods of the mythical consciousness structure. And so that's Gebser's main point in this chapter. Now I also want to illustrate this by mentioning William Gibson's short story, Johnny Mnemonic. Mnemosyne is, of course, the mother of all the Muses. Johnny Mnemonic suggests and implies her and her role. And the story, not the film, which is terrible, but the short story, which is one of Gibson's best, shows the role of the muse now insofar as that Johnny carries this data in his mind. He allows people to pay him for storing data, sensitive data, in his brain, to which he does not have the password and has no access to, for groups like the Yakuza or different kinds of mob or punk elements or whoever wants to store this data in him, so that they can't. So once it's in cyberspace, it can be, jacked and grabbed, as anyone knows, by hackers. And so they want to store it in his brain, but he doesn't know what's inside of his consciousness, which is a perfect capturing of the poet's relation to the muse now. He can no longer recollect. He can no longer remember history. Civilization has shifted into an amnesic, aphasic mental phase space. Gebser doesn't put it this way. He doesn't see it in these negative terms. But I think that what Gibson does is shows how the mind, how the poet, being disconnected from the muse, he's mnemonic, but yet he can no longer invoke the muse and can no longer recollect or remember what the data is totally cut off from the realm of history. So he lives in this kind of historyless world that is not quite the same as what Gebser was talking about, but it does, since Gebser sees this as a positive spiritual development, and I think the world that is painted by Gibson and Johnny Mnemonic is a very spiritually vacant, void wasteland of a world. And notice that at the end of the story, Johnny has to get the data out of his head by going to a dolphin. The Navy has used dolphins in the war for going to find mines, and has kept them addicted by means of heroin, so that Johnny has to barter with this sentient dolphin floating in a giant fish tank. He has to give him heroin because the dolphin has something called a squid that enables the dolphin to retrieve the password, so that he can get access to the data, which now Johnny, since he has access to all this data that's been stored up in his memory, that note he hasn't had any access to whatsoever. That's the poet cut off from the realm of history and recollection and the great events. He's been cut off from it. Now he has access to it, and he downloads some of it into a satellite to neutralize the Yakuza, whose data they want, and they've been tracking him. So now he has this power. He's retrieved the power over history by the end of the story. Note, with the aid of a dolphin, which is the symbol of the soul's water pole, the soul's life pole, which had been associated with muses and water and the soul's life pole. So with the soul's life pole, he retrieves the relationship to history and memory at the end of the story. So I think the story is not the film, which doesn't even touch the short story. The film is completely incompetent and should not be watched at all, but it's a perfect exemplification of the poet's failed and broken relationship to the muse now that we live in a civilization which is ahistorical, and all the grand culture forms have broken down. There's a will now not to remember the past, precisely to forget it, as Baudrillard points out in his various writings when he's talking about how Holocaust deniers are themselves symptomatic of this need, this will to forget history by pretending that these traumatic events never even took place, and that this is part of the amnesic and aphasic type of consciousness that we have entered into at the end of history. Gebser doesn't see it in this kind of wasteland sense. the way that Baudrillard does and Gibson does, but in the way also that I see it. His view is that it's a much more positive creation of this kind of giant mental noosphere that is broken off from history and is capable of using it without being dominated by it, but in a positive sense that brings rain to the wasteland, as it were. He doesn't see it in a negative sense. But anyways, that's the upshot of this essay, and then we'll move on into the next chapter.